Thank you for downloading this Council on Foreign Relations video. CFR is an independent national membership organization and nonpartisan research center. For more information, please visit us online at cfr.org.
I'm Ruth Greenspan-Bell from World Resources Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening. I've been on the other side of this, so I remember the ritual council warnings, which are, would you please turn off your cell phone, even if it vibrates, because sometimes it interferes with the speaker system. And this meeting is on the record. So our subject this evening is geoengineering, and in some parts of the environmental community, just saying the word geoengineering is a fighting word. It can be very contentious. In part, I think this represents some fear in some parts of the community that if you start talking about geoengineering, you give up on mitigation, you give up on adaptation, and just start trying to change the environment. There's, I think, some fear of the impression that there's a magic bullet involved. And I think my own personal concern is that I'm kind of worried that when the current climate deniers kind of wake up at some point and realize something is serious happening here, that they'll be seeking easy fixes. So I'm really, really pleased that the Council has chosen to have this conversation today, and particularly with these two speakers who I think are the perfect people to be talking about this. So we'll have a conversation for about a half hour, and then we'll open it up to questions at that point. I'm not going to repeat the bios that are in the handout that you have. Needless to say, we have two very distinguished speakers. John Steinbrenner is Professor of Public Policy at the University of Maryland and Director of the Center for International and Security Studies. And he's been a leading figure for many, many years in arms control and global security. Granger Morgan is professor and head of the Department of Engineering and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon University, and also for many years has been a leader in finding ways to describe scientific uncertainty and incorporate risk into public policy decision making. So we have totally the perfect people here to be talking about this issue. So I wanted to first ask Granger to sort of set the stage for us and to tell us, to start from almost a definitional point of view, what is geoengineering and why is this set of issues starting really to be discussed with some degree of seriousness at this point? What is it in the state of play of climate science and carbon regulation that might be stimulating this discussion?
Okay, and we're running the experiment tonight to see if an engineer is capable of talking without slides. Both John and I have slides that are out there on the table if you want copies of them. I thought actually I should start just a few steps even back from what you described and make sure we're all sort of up to speed on the climate problem. The sun shines on the Earth, of course, and about 30% of that light is immediately reflected back into space. And the other 70% is absorbed by clouds, by the surface, by the oceans, and so on. And of course, if that was all that happened, the Earth would rapidly heat up and we'd all fry. Somehow we got to get the same amount of energy back out into space as got absorbed. But once it's absorbed, it can't be re-radiated as light. It has to be re-radiated as heat, as infrared, you know, like a radiator radiates. And there's the rub, because the atmosphere, while it's transparent to the visible, is not transparent in the infrared. And so what happens is that the whole temperature of the planet warms a bit, and then finally it gets to a warm enough point that the amount of heat energy radiated off the top of the atmosphere is just equal to the amount that's being absorbed, and so the planet runs in equilibrium. And that's a good thing for us. This is the so-called greenhouse effect. And if it weren't for that, planet Earth would not be a terribly pleasant place to be. the two principal constituents in the atmosphere that absorb infrared are water vapor and carbon dioxide. And we have, for several hundred years now, been gradually increasing the concentration of carbon dioxide, and as a consequence, the mean temperature, or the average temperature at which the planet operates, goes up. So that's all kind of theoretical, and in the slides, one of the things you will see is a picture of a couple thousand megawatt coal-fired power plant just west of where I live, called the Bruce Manfield Power Station. A plant that size uses a couple hundred of these large 100-ton hopper cars of coal every day. And so to give it sort of a more concrete sense, a plant like that takes a couple hundred, a train of 200 cars, turns it into an invisible gas, puts it into the atmosphere every day, and we're doing that in hundreds of facilities like that all around the world. So though it's invisible, the mass volumes are quite large. The one other thing I should say about the physics or the science is that unlike conventional pollutants, unlike, say, sulfur dioxide, oxides of nitrogen, which when you put them in the atmosphere only stay there for a few hours or days. So if I stopped emitting sulfur dioxide, it would rapidly disappear, or if I stabilized emissions, concentrations would stabilize. CO2 and other greenhouse gases aren't like that. They live in the atmosphere, many of them, for 100 years or more, with the result that it's kind of like a big bathtub. If I had a bathtub with a small drain and a big faucet, unless I really close down the faucet, the bathtub will continue to fill up. And so think of the atmosphere as like that bathtub. And unless I dramatically reduce emissions by 80% or so globally, the level of concentration, or the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, will continue to rise. All right, that's all the science, but since it turns out many people do not understand this cumulative effect and the fact that one really does need to dramatically reduce emissions in order to stabilize concentration, I've started making a point of talking about this whenever I talk about climate issues. At Carnegie Mellon, we've been doing a variety of things on climate impact assessment and integrated assessment of climate problems for many years. When we first got started, we looked sort of systematically across the whole space, and one of the things we did was get a young postdoc, David Keith, to do quite an extensive review of geoengineering. It's an idea, by which I mainly mean changing the albedo, that is the fraction of sunlight that's reflected back to space. I told you it was about 30%. So this is not a new idea. People have been talking about it sort of on the fringes of the science community for many, many years, and we did a review and then we set it aside. Like many others, we were rather reluctant to work too seriously on the problem, in part because, you're sort of concerned that knowledge might drive intention. That is, that if you get to the point you really know how to do this and you know what it would cost and so on, that might raise the likelihood that somebody would do it. So for, 15 years or more, having done a set of fairly comprehensive reviews, we didn't work on it anymore. But then about 3 years ago, given the really abysmal progress that the rest of the U.S. and all the rest of the world are making in terms of reducing emissions, I began to get concerned, among other things, that somebody might wake up one day and say, oh my God, we got a problem. I mean, the Chinese, for example, might conclude, because of changes in precipitation, we can't feed our people, or Russia might conclude that all of Siberia is turning, with the permafrost thawing, is turning into an impenetrable bog. And so I got worried a bit about the prospect that somebody might, or some small group of folks, might go off and unilaterally just start doing this, having concluded we got a problem, we got to fix it. And at that stage, I decided maybe the foreign policy community should start thinking about this issue. So 3 of us at Carnegie Mellon on the technical side, and John and David Victor on the political science side, got together and I guess it was about 2 years ago now, ran an event in the old building up the street, in which a day-long event in which a good cross-section of leading people on the technical side of climate science sat down with a number of experts in the foreign policy community to think seriously about this. The participation in that group was all North Americans, and we decided we needed to broaden the discourse, and so at the invitation of the government of Portugal, we ran a similar event in Lisbon last April, in which, in addition to North Americans, we had a fair cross-section of folks from across the EU, from Russia, China, India, and elsewhere around the world. And both of these had as their objective to try to get the foreign policy community at least aware of this issue and beginning to think about it. Now I want to talk about two other things before I turn things over to John. First of all, the word geoengineering turns out to be sort of all-inclusive. I mean, to different people it seems to mean all kinds of different stuff. The Royal Society in London did an assessment recently. Actually, the discussion in the back of that assessment on governance builds directly on the results of the two workshops we ran, because two of the key authors had been participants in both of those workshops. And they did a very useful thing. They introduced two words, solar radiation management for stuff that involves changing the albedo. And actually, in a piece that we published in Nature about a month and a half ago, Nature used some phrase about sunscreens or sunshades, which is perhaps maybe even better. And then all the other stuff was termed carbon dioxide removal. And among other things, on that side, I mean, you can actually build devices to scrub carbon dioxide directly out of the atmosphere and then sequester it, that is, put it deep underground in appropriate strata. Those sorts of processes are inherently slow. They could be as cheap as $100 to $200 a ton, so they're important. They set an upper bound on what the cost of controlling CO2 might be. But they're inherently slow, and you could do them within the confines of a particular nation. I don't view them as posing significant governance issues. On the other hand, the stuff that involves changing the albedo by, for example, putting very fine particles in the stratosphere, and we can talk a bit more about how you would go about doing that, could be done at relatively low cost, perhaps 1/100th or less the cost of abating emissions, and could be done by a single state operating within the confines of its national borders. I have a doctoral student right now who, in collaboration with groups at Oxford, is doing climate modeling, and while you can indeed reduce the average temperature of the planet, it's imperfect. And the effects are different in different parts of the world, and over time, for example, she has looked at how China and India's climate might evolve, and while they're both closer to today's climate than they would be, say, 80 or 100 years from now, over time, in a space of temperature and precip, they move away from each other. Last comment. I think that it would be a real problem. Well, I've published in several places recently an argument that says the time has come to mount a serious research program here. I'm not talking about an enormous amount of money. I'm just saying that to date there's been hardly any serious research. And for two reasons, we need to get serious and understand what could be done and what it might cost. The first reason is that there's some possibility that somebody else would do it, and then if we thought that was a terrible idea, because, for example, it does nothing about the ongoing acidification of the oceans, which will probably leave us without coral reefs by the end of this century, or any of a number of other impacts from rising CO2. If we thought it was a bad idea, we need to know enough to be able to mount coherent counter-arguments. And the other reason we need to do research is to, in the event that we have a climate disaster, we know what we're getting into if we suddenly decided we had to do this, if we had 1 billion people at risk around the world, for example. And so in the back few slides of this thing that I've passed out is an argument that says one of the things the climate science community should start doing fairly quickly is figuring out a space in which they could do field experiments without any sort of international oversight or review. I think we do stuff in the stratosphere all the time, of course, and so it's not as though the stratosphere is absolutely pristine. But you don't want to have people going off and doing things that involve large radiative forcings or go on for extended periods, or for that matter, provide lots of reactive surfaces that could result in significant ozone destruction. So I think one of the early requirements for the science community is to figure out, can you define a sort of space within which, as long as you're behaving inside that space, issues of governance are not a big deal, but doing anything outside that space requires some collective agreement that it would be appropriate to do that. And at that point, I'm going to stop and let John pick up.
Oh, yeah, sure. Obviously, the questions then turn to governance issues, and that's what I'd like you to address. But a special question is, the UN negotiations have demonstrated the difficulty of getting a mutually acceptable agreement in place on the climate issues. I'm curious whether you would also address what this tells us about getting rules into place for geoengineering.
And maybe before John talks about that, I should say, I think that putting something in place quickly that made it really hard to do research on modest scales would be a disaster, but John and I may disagree.
Now, the role I've played is to try to anticipate what kind of rules would have to be applied if in this situation where, and there is a technique that almost certainly would work, and it is not very expensive. So it's not as if there's a lot of uncertainty about what to do. There's at least one technique that would reduce, mimicking the volcanoes, would reduce average surface temperature on the order of 0.5 degrees centigrade in a single year. But you'd have to keep doing it year after year. So I am anticipating a situation in which the image of global consequence becomes globally distributed, and people start to get concerned about their equity in this. And although I agree that it is desirable and probably feasible to set a limited space such that you could say, well, field experiments in this relatively modest range are okay. I'm not sure how limited that can be, because at some point the world is going to insist on having a collective stake in this, almost certainly, because you're dealing with a global commons. The atmosphere, which everybody breathes, is a global commons, if anything is. And the basic rules say nobody gets to appropriate for personal or sovereign use, and everybody's equity has to be taken into account. So what I'm saying is that because you can imagine having very substantial global effects on the basis of very small initiatives, anticipate the need for global rules which do not currently exist. There's no direct legal structure dealing with this question, not surprisingly, because it's just coming on the horizon. Trying to be practical about it, what I say is that it'd be a very good idea for the National Academies of Sciences to have coordinating mechanisms among themselves to set guidelines for field experiments that might, in fact, set your limits and say, this is what you can do, and these are the limits you have to adhere to. And if you go beyond those limits, what are the guidelines for doing a globally sort of credible review as to the relative merits? And I presume that nobody's going to go off and try to do this with no research whatsoever. So there'll be a period of time in which we are dealing with basically field trials. But I don't think it's too early to anticipate the possibility of a situation arising in which suddenly there is a great deal more fear than there currently is, coming much more rapidly than the scientists anticipate, clicking in. And at that point, we could have a real mess on our hands if there are no rules whatsoever. So what I'm saying is anticipate the need for having a basic principle, which is thou shalt not mess with the atmosphere unless everybody agrees in some globally representative way. And the criteria for judging this have to do with meeting a very heavy burden of proof. You have to demonstrate that the benefit to be achieved decisively outweighs the negative consequence. And I would say, and this is the important point, you have to demonstrate that this is not a substitute for mitigation. Because if it is, it's the equivalent of heroin addiction, basically. Once you start, you can't stop. And that you have not affected the underlying carbon buildup, so it is acidification in the oceans and all that is keep going.
You might explain why you can't stop.
Suggest
why you can't stop. You cannot stop because the technique that will work only works for a year or two. You put particles up, they come down within a year or two. The carbon dioxide stays for a century. So his bathtub analogy is the
reason. But the bathtub has continued to fill, so if you stop, suddenly you get a whopping big temperature increase, which just raises ecosystems.
And we're messing around with the rate of temperature increase. I think it's fair to say we're projecting a rate of increase that the geological record has never seen. So we're messing around already with global balances that could conceivably put everyone at risk. And if you want the nightmare scenario that might wake everybody up and suddenly make this a much bigger deal than it has been, it's the possibility of a surging release of frozen methane, gas hydrates, that would produce a positive feedback cycle. And that could create an image of real catastrophe. I mean, real catastrophe that would seize everybody's imagination, way out in front of what the scientists could really sort out. And that's been hypothetical. I've been saying this for about a year since we've been talking about it, and people have been saying, yeah, but it's, but they've just measured it in the Arctic shelf. It's the first observation, but I would say we ought to pay attention to that because this is a potentially very big deal. Bottom line of all this is we need to start talking about it in terms of the governance issues. What kind of rules do we need to put in place to provide adequate vetting for any initiative? And unfortunately, it's not just big governments that could do this. It is small governments. It is billionaires probably could figure out, I'm going to save the world all by myself, and I won't bother to mention it. So you've got a situation in which small initiatives could have a global effect, and we don't have any rules for dealing with that, and I'm saying it's time to start talking about the rules. I concede that on this subject and in general, it's not popular to talk about global rules. So I'm telling you, however, we're looking at situations that's going to make it necessary, like it or not, and we ought to start thinking about it, please.
Can you mention what bodies you might have in mind? You mentioned an informal set of bodies through national academies of science that could work on these. Are there other bodies you think that would be well suited that you can imagine to take this responsibility? Or
well, you can imagine the coordinating mechanisms of the National Academy of Sciences working out some kind of understanding among them. And making themselves kind of maybe the global equivalent of an institutional review board for medical practice. If you do any experiment on human beings, you have to justify yourself to institutional review boards to do it independent, that you're not subjecting the subjects to unnecessary risk. I think they could, using that analogy, they could set up a basic mechanism and understanding on the way Granger's talking. Okay, if you're operating within these fairly narrow or limits where we don't think there's going to be any major global consequence, do it on your own, or you can do it on your own, but there are disclosure rules, transparency rules. You got to publish what you're doing. You can't hide it. If you go beyond these limits, and the limits need some agreement, then there has to be, I would say, some common vetting process that they would have to organize among themselves collectively. We all have a stake in that. And I would say it's good to start talking about just that much. But what happens if tomorrow we get sort of somebody announce, okay, we've got frozen gas hydrates coming out like crazy, and unless we stop this, we're all dead. And people start believing that. What do we do? At that point, if you're talking about real emergency things, I'm saying, well, if you're looking at the only mechanism we have at the moment for global vetting, you're talking about the UN Security Council. Mm-hmm. You're going to have to go through that. And if you don't like that, then think of something else, because don't think that you can do this on your own without triggering real reaction. And this is something that if people think they're going to get excited about, they're going to get really excited about, and you're not going to be able to act unilaterally, say I.
A couple more comments on sort of coordination and who might do what. As I mentioned, the Royal Society has done a study that, among other things, introduced this very useful distinction between solar radiation management and carbon dioxide removal. The Royal Society is getting geared up right now to do a second round of work on global governance issues. It'll be an informal kind of thing. In the paper that John and I and our co-authors published in Foreign Affairs, we also raised the prospect that ICSU, the International Council on Scientific Unions, might be a candidate for coordinating at least research activities among different research groups around the world. I want to reiterate what John said, which is I think that any research in this area needs to be open. I think it would be truly disastrous if, we discovered a few years from now that there was a black program that some government had stood up to sort of learn on the quiet how to do this. I also think that we do need to get a serious research program going, because the sorts of events that John's talking about, that is a climate catastrophe of one sort or another, are still way out in the tails of the probability distributions of our uncertainty. I don't think there are very many scientists who would say they're high probability events, but they are out there. There is some, it's not zero. Mm-hmm. And you don't want to be in the position of suddenly deciding you got to do something dramatic quickly if you haven't studied it and you don't know what might happen.
Right. Just one little bit. The burden of proof on the moment, quite appropriately, falls very heavily on anybody who wants to proclaim a catastrophe. You have to demonstrate to confidence that it will shift in public a lot sooner than it'll shift among the scientists. And if it did, if some image of a catastrophe started to take hold, it would be very difficult to disprove it also. When you're dealing with out on the tail, low probability events, whoever carries the burden of proof to say it might happen loses. And so what you have to worry about is some image of catastrophe that seizes broad imagination, and the scientific community cannot disprove it. And you could get that. This frozen gas hydrate thing has some potential in that regard.
So you started the session by saying many people look at this and think it's a really awful idea. And I agree. And I think that's actually a good thing that many people look at this and think it's an awful idea. Messing with the planet is not something one should do lightly. And actually, it was very interesting. The Russian participant at this workshop we ran in Portugal reminded us about various Russian attempts to, you know, redirect rivers and otherwise engineer the landscape, and you know, pointed out that there was a lot of hubris here and it didn't work out too well. You don't want to, so if you do as a last resort have to engage in such activity, you don't want to do it without knowing quite a lot about it.
Right.
I was going to actually ask a question about the flip of the rush to judgment, which is if, you know, if serious scientists at some point decide, and governments even decide at some point intervention is necessary, and you think about kind of the normal NIMBY writ large problem that we see in other environmental and other areas, is there any active preparation going on at this stage to kind of introduce? I mean, I realize the Royal Society and others have issued these, but I sort of suspect
well, there's a bunch of stuff going on. I mean, I spent the last 2 days at a workshop over at the Bipartisan Commission. I forget exactly what it's called.
National Energy.
Yeah, right.
Global Task Force on Geoengineering.
Which has got a task force that it's putting together on this. In a couple of weeks, there's a 4 or 5 day event out at Asilomar to be trying to start some conversation on this. So there's a bunch of low-level things going on. There's this Royal Society event that I described. But, you know, it's also politically reasonably touchy, I think. I mean, John Holdren quite appropriately noted that we should not completely take this off the table, and Seth Bornstein, of course, turned it into a big article implying that, you know, that the administration was about to embark on this, which is not, I mean, so, you know, it's touchy. I mean, it is very press-worthy, so, you know, I'm not faulting either one of them in that case, but you can also understand why people might be a little reluctant to publicly argue that we need a research program. I don't think we need a big program at the moment. I think that some tens of millions of dollars spent appropriately through places like NSF and maybe NOAA and NASA at later stages would be entirely appropriate at this point. I mean, it really is the case that we're almost dead in the water with respect to serious research on this problem. About the only thing that's been done has been some computer modeling using general circulation models. And it is pretty clear that one will have to do some small-scale field stuff to really understand some of the technology. The other thing we ought to be doing is having some instrumented aircraft available, so if and when we get the next Mount Pinatubo, we're all set up to go and study in detail the processes involved.
Too many earthquakes, not enough volcanoes right now. Right?
Yeah, although my suspicion is if we had a volcano tomorrow, we wouldn't be in a position to do that.
I'm not urging it. Okay, why don't we now actually invite the audience to join into this. We have microphones that we're going to pass around, and I would ask you to please speak directly into the microphone and state your name and affiliation. Mr. Topping.
My name is John Topping with the Climate Institute, and Mike McCracken, our chief scientist, and together with the Climate Response Fund is essentially organizing the Asilomar meeting, and you know the whole purpose of that is to really try to develop some guidelines that would be very useful, and both I can't speak for exactly what will come out of it. There'll be about 150 experts from a number of countries there. But what's interesting, I think, on just on this issue is that there are a range of possibilities, some of which might be almost win-win. I mean, one idea that I've heard Russell cites, I think at Harvard, is essentially advance the idea of essentially micro bubbles. Well, they may or may not work. If it works, what it does is presumably is to reduce evaporation, which is a huge problem in the reservoir. So it's a kind of win-win strategy, and conceivably it's a soft way of testing something that might work much more broadly. You also have in the Arctic, when we talk about runaway or rapid climate change, I think the greatest concern would be.
Can you hold the microphone up?
I'm sorry, would be
Right,
melting, let's say in Greenland, or obviously the methane releases. Well, black carbon plays a very, very large role in some of that, and there's now efforts underway, an ANSI study that ultimately might result in an ISO standard that essentially is looking at perhaps the possibility of establishing a regional warming, global warming potential, looking at the Arctic. What happens in the Arctic, that a large part of the black carbon essentially comes from forest fires in Alaska, Canada, Siberia, open burning in Kazakhstan. Well, conceivably, better forestry practices are a way of addressing that. And then you get into the other issues, perhaps, rather than global geoengineering, what you might find if we got into the very difficult situations that we described, it might be that very localized regional geoengineering over affecting Greenland or affecting the Antarctic might be feasible. At the same time, you go with an aggressive mitigation strategy, and that's, I think that's perhaps one of the things that might be on the table, but they all have to be vetted.
There are quite a few parts to that question. Could I suggest one thing as a starting off this? A lot of this, I think, is a little bit inside baseball, and because there's some people in the audience who've been focused on this for a really long time, and some folks who are new to it. So maybe you can explain some of these things that John mentioned before we respond to it. Black carbon,
Let me just comment on the microbubbles idea.
Microbubbles, yeah. Can you explain what it is first?
Microbubbles are very tiny bubbles, sort of micro-scale bubbles that sustain themselves over very long periods of time at the right size in water. There's an issue of how much energy it takes to do it over a large scale, okay? But it's quite dramatic. And I think Russell Seitz is now making a local, not a global claim, that you can put them in lakes that are subject to evaporation. You could reduce the evaporation and have a beneficial local effect. I don't think and it's just at a laboratory basis so far, so I don't think he's ready to say, we're going to put microbubbles all over the ocean and solve the problem. If you did, though, looks like it would have less consequence than the sulfates in the stratosphere. So one of the things that needs to be looked at is things that can be done either locally or globally that don't have dramatically bad side effects or very uncertain ones.
Granger, did you want to talk about black carbon, or there's a second
no,
part?
I think we should
keep going.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? Please.
Hi, I'm Cheryl Hogue with Chemical and Engineering News. I'd like for you all to talk a little bit about what you foresee as possible research by the U.S. government. I think there were a couple of agencies mentioned. I know that Chairman of the House Science and Technology Committee, Bart Gordon, is really hot for the Department of Energy to be involved in this, although that sounds more like carbon capture and sequestration rather than the kind of solar radiation management. Could you talk a little bit more about that and how you foresee the U.S. government's role in research?
Yeah, I think first that it probably is important that there be federally supported research. I'm troubled by the prospect of private venture people getting into this business because, among other things, suddenly there becomes then an incentive to do it. And on the one hand, I think it's terribly important that we understand what it would cost, how you would do it, what the intended and unintended consequences would be. I think that in the early stages, National Science Foundation might be actually quite a good venue because, they are in the business of exploring a wide range of issues, opportunity for multiple investigators with different perspectives, opportunity for folks to work on some of the social science issues. We've actually been with some NSF money doing some work in this space. And as I say, I don't think at this stage large amounts of money are needed. Later on, when you are actually trying to run some field campaigns, then NASA might be an interesting candidate because you know, they've got a strong capability to do things in the stratosphere. That's probably sufficient.
Let me just say, though, that remember, the underlying situation is you don't want to do this without mitigation. And we are not, one of the problems is we are not on course to do prudent mitigation. So part of the research effort has got to go into alternative technologies for mitigation. That
I'm certainly not proposing that this be instead of. I mean, and the amount of money I'm talking about is pretty modest compared with the amounts we're now spending. But I mean, stop to think about it. We've been talking for a couple of decades about carbon capture and deep geologic sequestration in the context of coal-fired power plants. And we're beginning to do a few minor things, but we still haven't got the first commercial scale plant up and running. All the pieces have existed at commercial scale for quite a long time, but we just haven't spent the money to put the pieces together. If you asked me to bet today on who will get the first commercial scale plant up and running, I'd put more money on the Chinese than I would on the U.S. So John's absolutely right. I mean, it is really dismaying the slow rate of progress. And it's also dismaying that we got so many people playing my technology is more virtuous than yours. I mean, if we're going to achieve an 80% reduction in emissions, it's literally going to take everything we've got. And even still, I think there are good questions about whether we'll make it.
I was going to say I'm biting my tongue, Steve, about the small reactor story, but I'll give it. It's very difficult to imagine how we're going to get a prudent standard without an expansion of nuclear power that is much broader than anything going on or even imaginable with current reactor designs. So one of the conclusions you reach, or current fuel cycle management practices, or current security relationships. So one of the things that you can say, I think, with some seriousness is that one of the things we're going to have to do in order to have any hope is to develop small, inherently safe, sealed reactor designs that you can put around the world, and the people who use them do not get at the fuel, cannot get at the fuel. But that's an entirely different industry from what we're currently talking about. So one of the things that absolutely needs to happen is that there are about 8 or 10 of these designs, which is too many. There needs to be a runoff among them, and 2 or 3 of them brought to the point of commercial viability. And whatever else you do, you're not going to make it without that. But you're going to have to do a lot of other things as well.
We got another, yeah, over here.
Please.
Hi, Alex Dagan, USAID. First, I'd like to thank the Council for having something on science policy. It's very welcome, and I applaud you on sort of the scale of your vision and for how you're thinking about these problems. I have a point and a question. The point is, in biological control, whenever we've tried to use biocontrol to control certain types of pests that we want to get rid of, and we used other biological mechanisms to do so, we failed miserably many, many times. And that leads to the second question, or the question that I have is, what effect in terms of these microparticle shading? You have indicated that you've done modeling on, your postdoc has done modeling on temperature, modeling on precipitation, but given that there's potential heterogeneous effects, what is the effect on photosynthesis and how that photosynthesis feeds back within the process?
Well, first of all, we're not talking about more than a couple % change in the light flux. Second, after some volcanic eruptions, though there has been direct reflection the albedo has increased. The amount of diffuse sunlight has also increased. So there's actually been a bit of an uptick in photosynthesis, and you've seen some modest increase in forest growth and that sort of thing. I mean, when Kate Rickey, this doctoral student, and I first started working this problem, we were quite concerned about the issue of photosynthetic effects, and went out and talked with a bunch of leading ecologists. So far, we haven't been able to find anybody who can make a case that there would be a serious issue, and there might indeed, as I said, be some short-term boost, which, of course, alone doesn't mean it doesn't have impacts, because you know, different plants have different abilities to engage in photosynthesis. So just as a richer CO2 climate or atmosphere favors some plants over others, so too a changed light environment changes the relative competitive advantage of different plants. I want to hit one more time the ocean acidification issue. If you're not aware of this topic, take a look at the slide on the bottom of page 15, which has the Keeling curve that everybody has seen. This is the curve on Mauna Loa. There are now similar curves all over the world that show the regular increase of CO2 modulated by the annual cycle of vegetation. What you haven't perhaps seen is this lower curve, which is the pH of the oceans. And pH is a log metric. So what this is saying is that the oceans are today 30% more acidic than they were in pre-industrial times. This is not caused by geoengineering, but the key point is that geoengineering, while it can offset warming, doesn't do anything about this. And so here are some pictures on the next slide. They're much more striking in color of what coral reefs look like. Now, I must say that when we were publishing a piece a few years ago, for those in the press here, I'm off the record. My editor said, "Why do you care about coral reefs? You know, they're pretty, but coral reefs are, in fact, of course, the base of multiple ocean ecosystems." I'm back on the record, but I don't want to get any editors in trouble. Yeah.
You're messing with the bottom of the food chain.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Not a good idea.
I'm Eli Kintish with Science Magazine. First question's for John. You deal with lots of different countries in your work on non-proliferation. Do we know anything about what the other superpowers or the biggest players think about this? And the second question is, your idea was we won't mess with the atmosphere unless we all come to an agreement. But we have lots of international laws in which some countries might disagree. Why is that? If we were all in a room and one person was drowning or something, we might act in a way that would, cause discomfort to help that person.
This gentleman, incidentally, you should know, in full disclosure, was at our meeting in Portugal, and I think you're writing a book, right?
Comes out next month.
Yeah.
On geoengineering.
I was going to ask you, for that reason, what your sense of the state of major power discussion here, but I don't think, to put it mildly, not very far along would be the answer. And I'm not aware of any. Well, I've gone to the State Department and talked about it, and they were kind of, oh yeah, really? I mean, they're not doing anything that I can detect that is attempting to engage broad discussion on this question. Go ahead.
No.
Well, may I just add, to be more specific, are the Chinese engaging in some of these discussions? For example, in Lisbon, did you have?
Well, I mean, we had at this meeting in Lisbon someone from China, but they didn't talk about any active research program. I frankly do not know.
Get your microphone.
My name is Michael Morans. My questions are two. One is on the bubbles. I keep thinking about the conflict of trying to put fluoride in water, the politics of that, and or using gene changes in meat. There's a huge part of the population that would oppose it. And the second is, you keep focusing on catastrophe rather than a long-term problem, as if it's going to take a catastrophe to be reactive rather than proactive. Would you comment on that?
Yeah. Well, I would like to believe that sweet reason propagates itself and that the world gradually comes to believe that we have to do something about this without any image of catastrophe needing to trigger it. Human beings being what they are, though, and political processes being what they are, it's a lot easier to believe that we will suddenly get a lot more serious, and we do have to get a lot more serious if there is. Now, obviously, my favorite scenario is that a generation comes of age, realizes this problem, and gets a lot more serious about it spontaneously, just because we know enough about it to realize that we really ought to be taking prudent action. Every time I say something like that, though, I run into, like, a friend just a few weeks ago who is working for somebody who I guess is going to run for governor of New York and has done very extensive polling and asked people, what do you care about? Didn't show up in New York, didn't show up. Now, you know, it's pretty obvious that people are worried about their jobs and that sort of thing, but it is literally not on the, it doesn't get onto the list, never mind down the list. So if public reaction is got a long way to go before it will support the fairly dramatic changes required to really achieve mitigation. And that's why we all get driven into these catastrophe scenarios. Plus, you can comment on this maybe, right? The people watching the climate and its effects are getting nervous. I mean, they're seeing changes going a lot more rapidly than they anticipated. And although they can't come up and say, now we proved that we're going over a cliff, they're getting noticeably uneasy. So, you know, I'm sensing, if you will, that we're going to have to go to a different state of public consciousness, and it's probably going to be an image of big trouble that is clearer than we currently have that would get us there.
So just a couple of quick elaborations. First of all, of course, there is a lot of money getting spent to make sure that a very substantial portion of the public stays totally confused about this. I mean, it's been really quite pernicious, but there's been literally tens of millions of dollars spent on every little thing that comes along that might you know, relate to some uncertainty. And while sure there's uncertainty about some of the details of the climate science, there isn't any uncertainty about whether we have a serious problem. The other issue is that there are folks running around saying, this is going to be incredibly expensive, it's going to just totally wreck the economy. Well, you can recall that many of those same people made precisely that same argument about the Clean Air Act. And the electricity industry met the requirements for the Clean Air Act at a cost of, well, actually the economy met the requirements of the Clean Air Act at a price that was about 0.5% of GDP. Now, if you were going to decarbonize the energy system on a gradual basis over the next 50 years or so, by which I mean, for example, in electricity, roughly doubling the rate of new construction and never building anything that was not zero carbon, you could probably decarbonize the entire system for something like 0.7% of GDP. But you can make it as expensive as you want. I mean, if you hold off and then suddenly decide, oh my God, and we got a real problem, and you have to junk a lot of technology that's still got useful life, you can make it really expensive. So the folks who say you could wreck the economy this way aren't wrong. They're just not telling you the whole story. I mean, it won't wreck the economy if you go about it in a systematic way. You will wreck the economy if you wait till the last minute and then suddenly discover that you got to junk 2,000 megawatt relatively new coal-fired power plants.
And to add that, there's a lot of liquidity running around the financial system looking for the next bubble. This is actually, the energy transformation is a very productive place to put your money. You can make money doing that, and it's a productive result. So it doesn't appear to be at least hopeless to convince the markets that rather than go create some speculative Ponzi scheme, put money into a transformation we know we're going to need, and you can make a lot of money doing it. Whoever sort of gets the lead sort of items in this area, and I think conceivably you can convince the markets that this is a good place to invest. And Granger is exactly right. The problem is to try to do it on a prudent schedule, not to wait until there's some kind of crash effort that has to be.
But you see, because as John says, we are human, and there is a good possibility that that's the way it will play out. I mean, my concern is that we get into a mode where we wait. Oh my God, there's no way we can do it fast enough. We got to do geoengineering. Yeah. And so that's another.
Forget the other.
Yeah,
and
that's
really
another
is
reason why
heroin.
I think you really have to understand today, not just what could be the direct consequences, but what might be the downsides. And is it really indeed as simple and straightforward as many people think? I mean, for example, there's some recent results that suggest that sulfate may not be a terribly effective strategy, that you may want to use sulfuric acid. One of the things, of course, that people worry about is what about acid rain? Well, it turns out that the amount of material that you have to put in the stratosphere to offset is really small in comparative terms. And so the ecological impacts of fallout are not likely to be significant. And there are people also talking about specially engineered particles that would self-orient, self-levitate. I mean, there's all kinds of fairly wild possibilities, but nobody's working seriously on most of them.
I think I see another.
Yeah, you've got three here
please.
now.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Jim Turner from NOAA. First of all, thank you very much for talking about ocean acidification. But I do have a question about some of the field-scale experiments that you were talking about doing. What are some of the parameters that you would need? Because you certainly need something that's big enough so that you can detect an effect, and also something that is large enough so that you can learn enough to extrapolate from it. So can you talk about some of the parameters? When you talk about a limited scale field test, can you talk about the kinds of size you're talking about?
So not everything you do. Yeah, please.
Let's do this. There, I see two more hands, so let's accumulate the
Okay,
questions,
fine.
and then, because we're sort of almost at the end of the
All
time.
right, fine.
This is a general question, but besides Al Gore and the three of you, where's the leadership going to come from to engage these projects and move forward?
And there was another, or was I mistaken?
Yeah, it's.
Okay.
Spurgeon Keening, I just wanted to ask whether the proposal I've heard that it would be useful to paint all roofs, parking lots, and roads white so the light would be reflected directly out. If that was suddenly done, would that make a measurable effect, or would it be irrelevant in the largest scheme of things?
I'll take the first and the last, and John can get the middle one. He is, after all, the political scientist up here. Not every experiment that you'd want to do in the atmosphere needs to be a long-term measurement of changes in forcing. I mean, for example, there are serious questions about how would you introduce the material. You may want to introduce it as in a gaseous or liquid form. You may, and so you need to look at how spray technology works. And so there are a bunch of things that you could do on really quite small scale. There are folks talking about trying to do synchronous detection studies. So far the numbers I've seen suggest that the forcing levels you require may be fairly high, but the notion of synchronous detection is that if you put stuff in at a phase that's not in sync with the diurnal, or I mean with the annual cycle, that you might be able to pull a signal out from the noise. But it's precisely thinking seriously about some of this stuff that needs to happen, and so far it hasn't. On the parking lots, I've never run the numbers, but I know somebody who claims to have run the numbers that says white roofs and white parking lots don't appear to have a big effect, but I should run the numbers myself.
As for leadership, I wish I knew. It's a little hard to see. But, you know, you could say, if you want to be on the upside, when there really are emergency situations, usually leaders do emerge. I don't think they're out there in any, and if you're talking about globally credible leadership on this question, it ain't there at the moment.
Yeah, I wrote an editorial in Science, a long time ago now, over a decade ago, called Managing Carbon from the Bottom Up, that argued that we were putting altogether too much effort into trying to negotiate a global regime to which everyone would salute and sign up, that a far more plausible route forward was to get various parts of the world to each decide this is a serious problem, we got to do something about it, and then gradually to coalesce these different regimes. And so, you know, in this country, we see California trying to do reasonably serious stuff, and we have a few others around the world who are trying to do reasonably serious stuff. I think maybe a little less attention on trying to negotiate a single all-encompassing agreement that has real teeth and impact, and a little more work here at home on sort of getting out front would be a good place to start. And so, for example, getting a half dozen 800 megawatt coal-fired power plants built with carbon sequestration, doing a much bigger program of nuclear rejuvenation and renewal than we have, and a whole variety of really going in a serious way after energy efficiency. You'll notice that we're looking at a whole slew of incandescent lights here in a new Leeds building. Working on a bunch of those things would be probably very desirable.
We need to wrap this up, unfortunately. Let me just, 2 points. Some people think that the Copenhagen Accord actually represents the beginning of that bottom-up that you're suggesting, this putting commitments on the table. Who knows? I mean, it's another hour debate, which we won't go into here. I want to thank you both for this. It's a beginning of a really important conversation that we all need to be having on this issue. And I want to thank the audience for some really good questions. And good night. And I'm supposed to also remind everybody that this was on the record. That's what my cheat sheet here says.
Except for my crack about an
Except for that one, yes. Right. Do not record that.
Thank you for watching this Council on Foreign Relations video. For additional audio, video, and transcripts of CFR meetings, as well as expert analysis of international news, please visit us online at cfr.org. Thank you for downloading this Council on Foreign Relations video. CFR is an independent national membership organization and nonpartisan research center. For more information, please visit us online at cfr.org.
I'm Ruth Greenspan-Bell from World Resources Institute, and it's my pleasure to invite to welcome you here this evening I've been on the other side of this, so I remember the ritual council warnings, which are, would you please turn off your cell phone, even if it vibrates, because sometimes it interferes with the speaker system. And this meeting is on the record. So our subject this evening is geoengineering, and in some parts of the environmental community, just saying the word geoengineering is a fighting word. It can be very contentious. In part, I think this represents some fear in some parts of the community that if you start talking about geoengineering, you give up on mitigation, you give up on adaptation, and just start trying to change the environment. There's, I think, some fear of the impression that there's a magic bullet involved. And I think my own personal concern is that I'm kind of worried that when the current climate deniers kind of wake up at some point and realize something is serious happening here, that they'll be seeking easy fixes. So I'm really, really pleased that the council has chosen to have this conversation today, and particularly with these two speakers who I think are the perfect people to be talking about this. So we'll have a conversation for about a half hour, and then we'll
percent is absorbed by clouds, by the surface, by the oceans, and so on. And of course, if that was all that happened, the Earth would rapidly heat up and we'd all fry. Somehow we got to get the same amount of energy back out into space as got absorbed. But once it's absorbed, it can't be re-radiated as light. It has to be re-radiated as heat, as infrared, like a radiator radiates. And there's the rub, because the atmosphere, while it's transparent to the visible, is not transparent in the infrared. And so what happens is that the whole temperature of the planet warms a bit, and then finally it gets to a warm enough point that the amount of heat energy radiated off the top of the atmosphere is just equal to the amount that's being absorbed, and so the planet runs in equilibrium. And that's a good thing for us. This is the so-called greenhouse effect. And if it weren't for that, planet Earth would not be a terribly pleasant place to be. The two principal constituents in the atmosphere that absorb infrared are water vapor and carbon dioxide. And we have, for several hundred years now, been gradually increasing the concentration of carbon dioxide, and as a consequence, the mean temperature, or the average temperature at which the planet operates, goes up. So that's all kind of theoretical, and in the slides, one of the things you will see is a picture of a couple thousand megawatt coal-fired power plant just west of where I live, called the Bruce Manfield Power Station. A plant that size uses a couple hundred of these large 100-ton hopper cars of coal every day. Climate impact assessment and integrated assessment of climate problems for many years. When we first got started, we looked sort of systematically across the whole space, and one of the things we did was get a young postdoc, David Keith, to do quite an extensive review of geoengineering. It's an idea by which I mainly mean changing the albedo, that is the fraction of sunlight that's reflected back to space. I told you it was about 30%. So this is not a new idea. People have been talking about it sort of on the fringes of the science community for many, many years, and we did a review and then we set it aside. Like many others, we were rather reluctant to work too seriously on the problem, in part because, you're sort of concerned that knowledge might drive intention. That is, that if you get to the point you really know how to do this and you know what it would cost and so on, that might raise the likelihood that somebody would do it. So for, 15 years or more, having done a set of fairly comprehensive reviews, we didn't work on it anymore. But then about 3 years ago, given the really abysmal progress that the rest of the U.S. and all the rest of the world are making in terms of reducing emissions, I began to get concerned, among other things, that somebody might wake up one day and say, oh my God, we got a problem. I mean, the Chinese, for example, might conclude, because of changes in precipitation, we can't feed our people, or Russia might conclude that all of Siberia is turning, with the permafrost thawing, is turning into an impenetrable bog. And so I got worried a bit about the prospect that somebody might, or some small group of folks might go off and unilaterally just start doing this. And so to give it sort of a more concrete sense, a plant like that takes a couple hundred, a train of 200 cars, turns it into an invisible gas, puts it into the atmosphere every day. And we're doing that in hundreds of facilities like that all around the world. So though it's invisible, the mass volumes are quite large. The one other thing I should say about the physics or the science is that unlike conventional pollutants, unlike, say, sulfur dioxide, oxides of nitrogen, which when you put them in the atmosphere only stay there for a few hours or days. So if I stopped emitting sulfur dioxide, it would rapidly disappear, or if I stabilized emissions, concentrations would stabilize. CO2 and other greenhouse gases aren't like that. They live in the atmosphere, many of them, for 100 years or more, with the result that it's kind of like a big bathtub. If I had a bathtub with a small drain and a big faucet, unless I really close down the faucet, the bathtub will continue to fill up. And so think of the atmosphere as like that bathtub. And unless I dramatically reduce emissions by 80% or so globally, the level of concentration, or the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, will continue to rise. All right, that's all the science, but since it turns out many people do not understand this cumulative effect and the fact that one really does need to dramatically reduce emissions in order to stabilize concentration, I've started making a point of talking about this whenever I talk about climate issues. At Carnegie Mellon, we've been doing a variety of things on...
Open it up to questions at that point. I'm not going to repeat the bios that are in the handout that you have. Needless to say, we have two very distinguished speakers. John Steinbrenner is Professor of Public Policy at the University of Maryland and Director of the Center for International and Security Studies. And he's been a leading figure for many, many years in arms control and global security. Granger Morgan is Professor and Head of the Department of Engineering and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon University, and also for many years has been a leader in finding ways to describe scientific uncertainty and incorporate risk into public policy decision making. So we have totally the perfect people here to be talking about this issue. So I wanted to first ask Granger to sort of set the stage for us and to tell us, to start from almost a definitional point of view, what is geoengineering and why is this set of issues starting really to be discussed with some degree of seriousness at this point? What is it in the state of play of climate science and carbon regulation that might be stimulating this discussion?
Okay, and we're running the experiment tonight to see if an engineer is capable of talking without slides. Both John and I have slides that are out there on the table if you want copies of them. I thought actually I should start just a few steps even back from what you described and make sure we're all sort of up to speed on the climate problem. The sun shines on the Earth, of course, and about 30% of that light is immediately reflected back into space. And the other 70